Moscow has given its blessing to Kim Il-sung's invasion of South Korea. The countdown to war begins as the battle plans are drawn up in Pyongyang. But why has Stalin decided that now is the right time for war? What will the United States do in response? And how does the powder keg on the Korean peninsula fit into the wider Cold War? Let's find out. I'm Indy Neidell. This is a Korean War in Real-Time background special. This is actually part 4 of our background mini-series on the history of Korea and the build-up to the war. In part 3, I covered things from late 1948 to early 1950, including the withdrawal of the U.S. and Soviet troops, the border skirmishes between North and South Korea, and the U.S.'s apparent step back from interest in the Asian mainland. I left off with Kim Il-sung, leader of North Korea, having decided that his only remaining choice to reunify the Korean peninsula is to invade South Korea. He has been badgering Joseph Stalin about an invasion of the South for some time now, but Stalin has kept him firmly at arm's length. That is, till January 1950, when Stalin finally agrees to give Kim a meeting to discuss the plans for invasion. But why the change of heart? Well, we need to look at Europe for some important context here. Gone are the remnants of the Second World War alliance between East and West. Most of the continent is now firmly divided into two political, economic, and military blocs, aligned with either the Soviet Union or the United States. While the West gave Poland up to the Soviet sphere of influence, there had been hopes that some sort of compromise could be reached in the rest of Central Europe. However, by now, Soviet-backed communists have taken control in Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. By the end of 1949, Germany, like Korea, is divided into two rival states. In the West, the communists in France, Italy, and Belgium have been excluded from government under pressure by the United States. Perhaps more significantly, in April 1949, the Western powers established NATO, specifically to deter Soviet aggression against Europe or North America. Stalin then looks to increase pressure on the United States by opening a new front in the Cold War. A North Korean conquest of South Korea would draw Western military strength out of Europe, weaken the American position in Asia, would expand the buffer zone along the Siberian border, and would squeeze the U.S. position in Japan. Also, Stalin has also just solved his China problem. What do I mean by that? Well, the Soviet Union and Mao Zedong's People's Republic of China have a history of conflict, political, territorial, ideological, and even just straight-up clashes of personality. In ideological terms, Stalin sees the Chinese Communist Party as a threat to Soviet domination of the communist world. But with war looking more likely in Europe, Stalin is keen to patch things up with Peking. In February 1950, the two countries signed the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance. With this, Stalin no longer needs to worry about his long southern frontier with China. He can pay more attention to the Korean peninsula. There are a few different interpretations as to how Stalin gives his final blessing to Kim, but most of these are quibbles about the detail. Adrian Buzo has a good write-up of the general course of events, so I'll leave that to him. On the 30th of March 1950, Kim and his delegation arrived in Moscow. During their subsequent talks with Stalin, the Koreans emphasized that a war with the South would be over within a matter of days. They would quickly capture Seoul, whereupon the ROK government would disintegrate, and a massive pro-North uprising would occur before the U.S. could intervene. Kim and Pak Hon-yong did not explain, and Stalin apparently did not press them to explain, why the guerrilla war in the South was going so badly if such deep reservoirs of support exist there. But their energetic presentation seems to have removed Stalin's remaining reservations. With swift U.S. intervention unlikely, a full-scale invasion represented a low-risk strategy, and Stalin sanctioned a DPRK offensive in general terms, subject to Chinese approval. Kim heads to Peking for a meeting with Mao from April 13th to 16th. After checking with the Kremlin, Mao gives his approval. For now, the Chinese will not take an active role in the preparations for war, leaving that to Moscow. By the end of April, a Soviet military team is in Pyongyang helping to draw up the battle plans. But those planners in Pyongyang in the spring of 1950 are working on some outdated assumptions. The public rhetoric that has been coming from Washington, which seems to indicate a declining commitment to Korea and Asia in general, is very different from the discussions happening behind closed doors, where American policy is taking a 180-degree turn towards a far more combative posture. This doesn't just come out of nowhere. U.S. President Harry Truman has already been taking a much tougher line against the Soviet Union in Europe since 1947, and the advent of what becomes known as the Truman Doctrine. In the summer of 1948, the U.S. made a big statement of its geopolitical interest in Europe with the Marshall Plan, an aid program which transfers over $13 billion to European countries. Along with rebuilding war-torn societies, the plan is also a direct challenge to the spread of communism in Europe. In June 1948, after the Soviets blockaded the Allied zone of Berlin, the U.S., the Western powers, called Stalin's bluff and launched the Berlin airlift. All of this culminated with NATO in April 1949, with Truman signing the North Atlantic Treaty, despite the concerns of some in Congress. Still, Truman faces intense pressure from fervent anti-communists, with Republican senators led by Joseph McCarthy accusing the administration of having abandoned China and being soft on world communism. But it isn't just external pressure that means Truman is reconsidering things beyond Europe. Growing numbers of Republicans were convinced that McCarthyism was their ticket to political power and were determined to back Joe's Red Hunt as long as the headlines continued to bombard the administration. By the midterm of Truman's second administration, he was already a beleaguered president, under immense domestic pressures for his alleged weakness in confronting the communist threat at home and abroad. Truman himself was increasingly convinced that the Soviets were risk-takers, opportunists who would press forward on every front when they detected weakness. The culmination of this is the National Security Council producing NSC 68, which is drafted in February and March 1950. I talked about this in the regular weekly episodes. NSC 68 calls for much greater defense spending and defines the Soviet Union as seeking the complete subversion or forcible destruction of the machinery of government and structure of society in the non-Soviet world, and their replacement by an apparatus and structure subservient to and controlled by the Kremlin. In effect, NSC 68 defines the Soviet Union not as a rival, a competitor, or even an enemy, but as an existential threat. There is debate over this in Washington. Some argue that Moscow is far more cautious than this document implies. But Secretary of State Dean Acheson accepts the main principle of NSC 68. It recommends the Soviets should be challenged wherever and whenever they launch an attack on American interests, and that there needs to be a massive buildup of American conventional and nuclear forces to protect the U.S. and its allies. Despite Acheson's own high-profile speech in January 1950, which I mentioned last time, and which appeared to have written off mainland Asia, American attention has in fact started to slowly turn back to the region over the past few months. Privately, Acheson has urged the administration not to let any other Asian countries fall to communism after China, and the U.S. is now supporting the French in Indochina against the communist Viet Minh. But although we can look back now in the fall of 1950 and see signs that Washington's position in mid-1950 is very different from their position even less than a year ago, this is not so readily apparent to the rest of the world. Washington's public rhetoric is still mixed and non-committal. NSC 68 itself remains a closely guarded secret. This mismatch puts Korea, and the rest of the world, on a dangerous path. In June 1950, the hardening of attitudes within the administration remained little understood within the United States, and scarcely at all outside it. NSC 68 has been cited as a classic example of a document whose secrecy destroyed its very purpose. The public signals reaching Moscow about American intentions thus remained unchanged and uncertain. Had the Russians possessed any inkling of the strength of Washington's newfound determination to seek a battleground upon which to challenge communist expansion, it is profoundly unlikely that Moscow would ever have allowed the North Korean invasion of June 1950 to take place. With that, the stage is set for war. If you want more detail on this period, between the spring of 1950 and the outbreak of war, June 25th, 1950, you should go and watch the first episode of my regular weekly Korea series. I go over these final weeks in more detail, look at the forces on the peninsula, cover North Korea's final preparations for war, and why South Korea and the U.S. were taken by such surprise. As we shall see, although America may have been caught by surprise, it is that very surprise which helps Truman make his mind up about things. He later writes, "The news of the invasion brought back memories of the 1930s, of the annexations of Manchuria, Ethiopia, and Austria. If this was allowed to go unchallenged, it would mean a third world war, just as similar incidents had brought on the second. It was also clear to me that the foundations and the principles of the United Nations were at stake unless this unprovoked attack on Korea could be stopped." It is this war that will consolidate Washington's transition to a worldview outlined in NSC 68. After referring the matter to the UN, America provides aerial and naval support to the South Koreans, starts shipping in ground troops, and is soon directly fighting and commanding the Western war against the forces of communism in Korea. It's not just in Korea either. Right after the invasion, the U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet patrols the Taiwan Strait, blocking any possible attempt by Mao to invade the island, deal with Chiang, and finish off the Chinese Civil War. After that, more aid will flow from Washington to Taiwan. At home, the military buildup begins in earnest. Between 1950 and 1953, the U.S. almost triples defense spending from 5% of GDP to 14.2%. But in all this talk of the Cold War, of great power rivalries, of NSC 68, we might be forgetting the Koreans. I started this miniseries talking about how Korea became a battleground for the Chinese, Japanese, and Russian empires in the late 1800s, and how Japan annexed and colonized the peninsula with the endorsement of Britain and the United States in 1910. Well, the fate of Korea is once again being determined by outsiders. Okay, of course, it was a Korean leader who started this by invading his Korean counterparts' land after years of mutual saber-rattling. And it is millions of North and South Korean civilians and troops who will die as a result. But pretty soon, control of the Korean War pretty much ceases to be Korean. I'll end today with this, again from Adrian Buzo. The initial assault was made possible by the Soviet interest, and its plan of battle was drawn up in the Russian language by Soviet military officers. Within months, both Korean leaders had been shunted aside, and the course of the war was determined not by Koreans for Korean ends, but by Americans, Soviets, and Chinese for American, Soviet, and Chinese ends. This is the Korean War. If you'd like more on that Cold War rivalry, you can click here for our day-by-day coverage of the Cuban Missile Crisis on our Time Ghost History channel. It is the Time Ghost Army that allows us to do that whenever it comes up, and this and everything we do. So join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. See you next time.